The crack of glass breaking startled me awake. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but the sound came again, sharp, unmistakable. Someone was in the house. My first instinct was to grab the baseball bat I kept under the bed. Jessica, my wife, wasn't there beside me. My pulse quickened. "Jess?" I called out, my voice low but urgent. No answer. I crept toward the noise, the bat gripped tightly in my hands. The sound was coming from the kitchen, where the faint glow of the refrigerator's light spilled across the floor. I peeked around the corner and froze. Jessica was there, but she wasn't alone. Her back was to me as she whispered urgently to someone standing too close, their silhouette partially hidden in the shadows. A man taller than me, dressed in dark clothes. I watched as she handed him something wrapped in a plastic bag. They exchanged a few hurried words, too quiet for me to catch. The way she touched his arm, it wasn't casual. I wanted to rush in, to demand answers, but my body wouldn't move. I felt paralyzed, my grip on the bat tightening until my knuckles turned white. Jessica glanced over her shoulder suddenly, and I ducked out of sight, my heart pounding like a drum. The man slipped out the back door, disappearing into the night. Jessica stood there for a moment, staring after him, then quietly locked the door. She didn't notice me watching as she climbed the stairs back to our room. I waited until I heard the creak of our bed springs before I followed. When I walked in, she was lying there like nothing had happened, scrolling through her phone. "What was that noise?" she asked without looking up. "Something fell in the kitchen," I lied, my voice steady despite the storm of questions raging in my head. "Oh," she said with a yawn. "I didn't hear anything." I climbed into bed beside her, my thoughts racing. Who was that man? What had she given him? And why was she lying to me? I didn't sleep at all that night. Something was very wrong, and I needed to find out exactly what it was. The next morning started like any other. Jessica was already up, standing at the counter with her mug of coffee, scrolling on her tablet like she always did. She looked calm, unbothered, as if the previous night's events had never happened. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I might have believed her innocent smile and easy demeanor. But I did see it. And that changed everything. I stood there in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment, watching her. I had a million questions boiling under the surface, but I couldn't let them show. Not yet. Not until I knew more. Instead, I forced a casual tone. "Morning. What time did you get up?" She glanced up at me, her expression warm and effortless. "About an hour ago. I couldn't sleep after you got up." "Did you check what fell last night?" "Yeah, it was just the cutting board." "Must have slipped off the counter," I replied smoothly. She nodded, turning back to her tablet. I made my way to the fridge, taking out the orange juice, and poured myself a glass while I studied her from the corner of my eye. She looked normal. Too normal. It was like nothing had changed for her. I was careful to act the same way I always did, to keep things as routine as possible. I kissed her cheek before leaving for work, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I wanted to ask her what was wrong, why she seemed different lately, but I already knew I wouldn't get a straight answer. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in my car at the end of the driveway, my hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the house. The image of her in the kitchen with that man replayed in my head like a broken record. Every detail stood out, the way her shoulders had tensed, the way she handed him whatever was in that bag, the way she touched his arm. It wasn't just a coincidence or a misunderstanding. There was something going on, and I needed to find out what it was. I didn't know where to start. Jessica had always been meticulous about her privacy, even when we first started dating. She kept her phone locked, her emails private. It was never an issue before. I respected her independence, and she respected mine. But now? Now it felt like a wall I couldn't get through, and the need to climb it was suffocating. After sitting there for what felt like hours, I finally drove off. I didn't have a plan, but I knew I couldn't let this go. I needed answers, even if it meant breaking rules I'd never imagined breaking. The first thing I did was call in sick to work. I wasn't in the right frame of mind to deal with clients or colleagues. My boss sounded annoyed but accepted my excuse, telling me to get some rest. Rest was the last thing I had in mind. I decided to follow Jessica. It felt extreme, invasive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening under my nose. That afternoon, when she said she was heading out to run errands, I waited a few minutes before leaving the house and trailing behind her. She drove to the grocery store first, picking up the usual staples: bread, milk, fruit. Nothing out of the ordinary. I stayed a few cars behind, keeping my distance. When she finished, she didn't head home. Instead, she drove to a small cafe on the other side of town. I parked a few spots away and watched as she went inside. A man joined her a few minutes later, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't the man from last night. This one was younger, maybe in his early 30s, dressed in a suit that looked too expensive for this part of town. Jessica greeted him with a hug that lasted a second too long, her hand lingering on his back as they sat down. I stayed in the car, my heart racing, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly it hurt. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language spoke volumes. She leaned in close, laughing at something he said. He reached across the table and touched her hand. It was intimate, familiar. They stayed for nearly an hour. When they finally left, Jessica hugged him again, her lips brushing his cheek. Then they went their separate ways. I followed her home, my mind spinning with questions. Who was this guy? How did he fit into whatever was going on? And what about the man from last night? That evening, I sat at the dinner table with her and the kids, trying to keep up appearances. Jessica was cheerful, talking about her day as if nothing was wrong. I forced myself to smile and nod, but inside, I was screaming. After the kids went to bed, I finally couldn't take it anymore. Jess, can we talk? She looked up from her book, her expression unreadable. Of course. What's on your mind? I hesitated, searching for the right words. You seemed different lately. Is everything okay? Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. Of course. Why wouldn't it be? I don't know. You just seem distant. She reached across the couch and took my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. Tom, I'm fine. Work's been a little stressful, but it's nothing I can't handle. I promise. I nodded, pretending to believe her, but I didn't. I couldn't. Later that night, after she fell asleep, I got out of bed and went downstairs to think. My mind was racing, pieces of the puzzle floating around but refusing to come together. There was something going on, something big, and I was going to figure it out, no matter what it took. The next day, I woke up early. Jessica was already gone, her side of the bed cold. She left a note on the counter saying she'd gone to the gym and might run a few errands afterward. Her schedule was too predictable, too polished, like she wanted me to stop asking questions. I wasn't buying it. I spent the morning pacing the house, running through every scenario in my head. The image of her at the cafe with that man replayed over and over. I thought about the bag she handed over in the kitchen and the way she'd lied about it so effortlessly. I couldn't let it slide anymore. By the time she walked through the door just after noon, I was ready. She was carrying a shopping bag, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. Hey, you're home, she said with a casual smile, like everything was fine. We need to talk, I said, skipping any pleasantries. Jessica froze for a split second before recovering. Okay. What's wrong? Why don't you tell me? I leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. Her smile faltered, and she set the shopping bag down on the table. Tom, you're acting weird. What's going on? What's going on is you sneaking around, I said, my voice firm but calm. Who was the guy you met at the cafe yesterday? Her eyes widened, and she stepped back like I'd hit her. What are you talking about? Don't lie to me, I said, my tone sharper now. I followed you, Jess. I saw you. So stop pretending nothing's going on. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly scrambling for an explanation. Finally, she crossed her arms, her expression hardening. You followed me? Seriously, Tom? What the hell is wrong with you? What's wrong with me? I took a step forward, my anger rising. What's wrong with me is my wife sneaking off to meet some guy behind my back. What's wrong with me is finding you in the kitchen with a stranger in the middle of the night, lying about it like it's nothing. That's not what you think, she said quickly, her voice trembling slightly. Then explain it to me, I demanded. Who was he? And what's in that bag you handed him? Jessica looked away, her jaw tightening. It's complicated, she muttered. Complicated? I laughed bitterly. Try me. Because right now, it looks pretty damn simple. You're lying to me, sneaking around, and I don't know who you are anymore. It's not what you think, she repeated, her tone defensive. Stop saying that. I slammed my hand on the counter, making her jump. Just tell me the truth, Jess. All of it. Right now. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just stood there, her arms crossed, her eyes darting around like she was searching for an escape. Finally, she sighed and sat down at the table. Fine, she said, her voice low. I'll tell you. But you're not going to like it. I sat across from her, my heart pounding. Go on. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. The guy at the cafe, his name is Eric. He's an old friend. We've been working on something together. What kind of something? I asked, narrowing my eyes. Jessica hesitated again, then leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. He's helping me get some money together. For what? For us, she said, her eyes locking onto mine. I've been planning a surprise for you and the kids, a big vacation. Something we've been talking about for years but never had the money for. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. You're lying, I said finally. I'm not, she insisted. I swear, Tom. That's why I've been meeting him. He's loaning me some money until I can pay him back. And the guy from the kitchen? Was he part of this plan too? Her face paled, and she looked away. That's different. Different how? I demanded. He's just someone helping Eric with the arrangements, she said quickly. That's all. I didn't tell you because I wanted it to be a surprise. You expect me to believe that? I asked, my voice rising. It's the truth, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't mean for it to look this way, Tom. I was trying to do something good for us, for the family. I stared at her, searching her face for any sign of honesty. But all I saw was guilt. Show me, I said finally. Show you what? Whatever you've been working on with Eric. Show me proof. Jessica hesitated, then shook her head. I can't. Why not? Because it's not ready yet, she said quickly. And if I show you now, it'll ruin everything. Do you hear yourself right now? I asked, leaning forward. You're digging yourself deeper and deeper, Jess. Just tell me the truth. The real truth. She didn't answer. Instead, she stood up and grabbed her shopping bag. I don't have to sit here and listen to this, she said, her voice shaking. Don't you walk away from me, I said, standing up too. She turned to face me, her eyes blazing. You're the one who followed me, Tom. You're the one who doesn't trust me. So maybe you should take a good, hard look at yourself before accusing me of anything. With that, she stormed upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. I stood there in the kitchen, my fists clenched, my chest heaving. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The silence in the house was suffocating after Jessica locked herself in the bedroom. I stayed downstairs, pacing in the living room, replaying the confrontation in my mind. Her excuses didn't hold water, and her refusal to show me proof only cemented my suspicion. She thought she could manipulate me, twist the truth to fit her narrative, but I wasn't going to let that happen. Not anymore. I needed to regain control of the situation. If Jessica wasn't going to give me the truth, I would find it myself. I spent the rest of the evening strategizing, going over everything I'd seen and heard in the last few days. There was no doubt in my mind that she was hiding something big, and I was done playing the fool. The first step was to gather evidence. I didn't care how invasive it was. Jessica had already shattered the trust in our marriage, there was nothing left to protect. While she sulked upstairs, I started combing through the house. Her laptop was on the dining table, and I opened it, praying she hadn't changed her password. She hadn't. Her email was the first thing I checked. There wasn't much there, mostly work-related messages and a few from her friends. But when I searched for Eric, I found something interesting. A series of emails over the past few months, some of them innocuous, but others raising red flags. In one, Eric mentioned meeting to discuss the next step. In another, he confirmed receiving a package from her. The package. The one she handed to the man in our kitchen. My pulse quickened as I scrolled through the messages, piecing together a trail of vague but suspicious communication. Next, I went through her browsing history. She'd been careful, clearing most of it, but not everything. I found a link to a private chat service I didn't recognize. When I clicked it, it asked for a username and password. I tried her usual combinations but couldn't get in. Frustrated, I closed the laptop and moved on to her phone. Her phone was locked, of course, but I knew her passcode. She was in the shower when I grabbed it from the nightstand. I scrolled through her messages, finding nothing unusual until I got to the chat with Eric. Most of their messages were deleted, but a few remained, just enough to confirm my suspicions. One message, in particular, stood out: "Don't forget, he can't find out about this. It'll ruin everything. Ruin everything." Those two words rattled around in my head as I stared at the screen. Whatever Jessica and Eric were up to, it wasn't about a surprise vacation. It was about keeping me in the dark. By the time Jessica came downstairs the next morning, I'd already set my plan into motion. She acted like nothing had happened, smiling at me as she poured her coffee. "Morning," she said, her voice light and casual. I didn't respond. I couldn't bring myself to play along anymore. After breakfast, I told her I had errands to run. She barely looked up from her phone, waving me off as I left. I spent the day collecting more information, retracing her steps from the cafe to the man in the kitchen. I even hired a private investigator, someone who could dig deeper than I could. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. The investigator found out that Eric wasn't just an old friend. He was a coworker from her office, someone she'd been meeting with regularly after hours. As for the man in the kitchen, his name was Victor, a known associate of Eric's with a record of fraud and embezzlement. Jessica wasn't planning a vacation. She was planning something much worse. That night, I confronted her again. This time, I didn't hold back. "I know about Eric," I said as soon as she walked into the living room. Jessica froze, her face pale. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," I snapped. "I know everything. I know who he is. I know what you've been doing. And I know about Victor." Her eyes widened, and she took a step back. "Tom, you're being ridiculous." "Am I?" I said, pulling out my phone. I opened the screenshots of her messages, the emails, the photos from the investigator, and shoved them in her face. "Explain this." She stammered, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "It's not what it looks like," she finally said. "It's exactly what it looks like," I shot back. "You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around, meeting with criminals. What the hell is going on, Jessica?" She didn't answer. She just stared at me, her eyes wide and glassy. "I'll tell you what's going on," I continued, my voice cold. "You thought you could get away with it. You thought I wouldn't notice. But you underestimated me." "Tom, please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's not what you think." "Stop lying," I said, my voice hard. "You've had your chance to come clean, and you blew it. Now it's my turn." I spent the next hour laying out everything I'd uncovered, every detail of her betrayal. She tried to deny it at first, but as I pressed her, the truth finally came spilling out. Eric wasn't just a co-worker, he was her lover. They'd been having an affair for months, meeting in secret and using Victor to launder money they'd embezzled from her company. The package she'd handed over in the kitchen? It was cash money they were planning to split once the scheme was over. By the time she finished her confession, I was numb. I stared at her, the woman I'd loved for so many years, and felt nothing but disgust. "You've destroyed everything," I said quietly. "Tom, I didn't mean." "Save it," I snapped. "I don't want to hear your excuses. You're going to pay for this. You and Eric and Victor. All of you." She looked at me, her face crumpling. "What are you going to do?" "You'll find out soon enough," I said, my voice cold and steady. That night, I started planning my revenge. I didn't sleep at all that night. My mind was a storm of plans, calculations, and anger. Jessica had admitted everything, and now I held the cards. It was my move, and I wasn't going to play it lightly. By morning, I was ready to put the first part of my plan into action. Jessica, however, was trying to pretend life was normal. She moved around the house like we hadn't spent hours dissecting her betrayal the night before. She even had the nerve to suggest we have dinner as a family that evening. I let her think I was considering it. She didn't need to know what I had in store. When she left for work, I got to work myself. First, I contacted the private investigator I'd hired and handed over the evidence Jessica had confirmed the night before: her affair with Eric, the embezzlement, and Victor's involvement. I instructed him to compile everything in a neat, indisputable package. Then I called her company's HR department, introducing myself as an anonymous whistleblower. I provided just enough details about Jessica's and Eric's activities to pique their interest and assured them I would send over full documentation shortly. The HR manager was stunned, but she promised to investigate immediately. I wasn't done yet. I contacted a lawyer I'd quietly consulted after I first suspected something was wrong. With the evidence I now had, the lawyer assured me we could use Jessica's infidelity and criminal actions to secure a favorable divorce settlement. No alimony, no equal division of assets. I wouldn't just win, I'd walk away clean. By the time Jessica came home that evening, I was prepared. She walked into the house, her smile cautious but hopeful. "Hey," she said softly, setting her purse on the counter. "I was thinking we could talk tonight. You know, try to figure out where we go from here." I stared at her, the weight of everything she'd done pressing down on me. "Yeah," I said, my tone flat. "Let's talk." She hesitated, clearly thrown off by my demeanor, but she nodded and followed me into the living room. I didn't waste time. "I've contacted your company," I said bluntly. Her eyes widened, and she froze. "What?" "They know everything. About you, about Eric, about the money." I leaned forward, my voice calm but sharp. "You're going to lose your job, Jess. And probably your freedom too, once the police get involved." Her face turned pale, and she sank into the couch. "Tom, please," she whispered. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," I said. "You didn't just betray me, you broke the law. You put our family at risk. You don't get to walk away from that unscathed." Tears streamed down her face as she tried to plead with me. "I'll fix it," she said desperately. "I'll go to HR myself. I'll confess everything. Just don't ruin me like this." "You ruined yourself," I snapped. "This isn't about revenge, Jess. It's about consequences. Something you apparently didn't think about when you decided to screw me over." She buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. This was a woman I'd loved for years, the mother of my children. But that feeling was quickly replaced by the memory of her lies, her betrayal, and the cold calculation behind her actions. "There's one more thing," I said, my voice steady. She looked up, her face streaked with tears. "What?" "I'm filing for divorce," I said simply. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Finally, she managed a weak, "You don't have to do that. We can work through this." "No, we can't," I said firmly. "This marriage ended the moment you decided to betray me. There's nothing left to salvage." She shook her head, her tears falling harder. "Tom, please. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll quit my job. I'll never talk to Eric again. I'll..." "Stop," I interrupted, my tone sharp. "It's too late, Jess. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." For a long moment, she just stared at me, her expression a mixture of desperation and defeat. Then she nodded slowly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "I'll move out," I said. "I've already found a place. You can stay here with the kids for now, but once the divorce is finalized, we'll figure out a new arrangement." She nodded again, her eyes empty. "And the company? The police?" "That's out of my hands," I said coldly. "You'll have to deal with the fallout yourself." Jessica didn't say anything after that. She just sat there, staring at the floor, as I stood up and left the room. That night, I packed a bag and moved into the apartment I'd rented. It was small, nothing like the home I'd shared with Jessica and the kids, but it was mine. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't happy. Not yet. But I was free. The first few days after I moved out were surreal. The silence in my new apartment was heavy, the kind of quiet that forces you to think about things you'd rather avoid. I spent those early mornings staring at the ceiling, wondering if there was some way all of this could have gone differently. But deep down, I knew the answer. Jessica's choices had set this course in motion long before I even knew what was happening. She called me the day after I left. I ignored it. She texted next, asking to meet and talk, but I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in hearing her apologies or explanations anymore. She'd had her chance, and she'd squandered it. Instead, I focused on moving forward. My lawyer was already drafting the divorce papers, and with the evidence I'd gathered, it was almost guaranteed to go in my favor. The investigator had come through in ways I couldn't have imagined. Not only had he uncovered her affair and the financial scheme, but he'd also found messages between Eric and Victor that implicated all three of them in a fraudulent cover-up. The day the papers were filed, I sent Jessica a text, "You'll be served soon. I've instructed my lawyer to handle any communication about the divorce. Don't contact me unless it's about the kids." She didn't reply, but I didn't expect her to. My focus shifted to rebuilding my relationship with my children. They didn't know the full extent of what was going on, only that their mom and I were separating. I made a point to be there for them, to pick them up from school and take them out for dinner, to show them that even though their world was changing, I was still their dad. Jessica, on the other hand, was unraveling. Word of her affair and the embezzlement had spread through her workplace like wildfire. Eric had been fired, and Victor was under investigation for his role in the scheme. Jessica's job hung by a thread, and I knew it was only a matter of time before HR made their final decision. When she finally called me again a week later, I answered, mostly out of curiosity. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. I need to talk to you," she said, her voice shaky. "I told you, if it's not about the kids, go through the lawyer." "This isn't about the kids," she said quickly. "It's about us. About what happens next." "There is no us," I said bluntly. She sighed, and I could hear her trying to hold back tears. "Tom, I'm sorry. For everything. I don't know what else to say." "Sorry doesn't fix this," I replied. "Sorry doesn't undo what you've done. You didn't just cheat on me, Jess. You lied, you stole, and you dragged our family into your mess. I can't forgive that." "I know," she whispered. "I know I've ruined everything. But I don't know how to fix it." "You can't," I said. "That's the point. There's no fixing this. All you can do now is face the consequences." There was a long pause before she spoke again. Do you think you'll ever forgive me? I considered her question for a moment. Maybe, I said finally. But not now. And not in the way you want me to. Forgiving you doesn't mean I'll ever forget what you did, or that I'll ever trust you again. It just means I won't let this consume me anymore. Jessica didn't say anything after that. I hung up, feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. A few days later, she was officially terminated from her job. I heard about it through the investigator, who was still keeping tabs on the situation. Eric and Victor were also facing legal action, and it was likely that Jessica wouldn't escape unscathed. I wasn't proud of what had happened to her, but I didn't feel sorry for her either. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them. The divorce process was surprisingly smooth, thanks to the overwhelming evidence I'd collected. Jessica didn't fight me on anything, she knew she didn't have a leg to stand on. Within 3 months, the divorce was finalized. I kept the house, the savings, and full custody of the kids. She moved into a small apartment across town, and our communication became strictly about the children. Life didn't immediately get better after the divorce, but it did get simpler. The weight of Jessica's betrayal was still there, but it wasn't crushing me anymore. I focused on my kids, my job, and myself. One evening, a few months later, my daughter asked me, "Are you happy, Dad?" The question caught me off guard, but after a moment, I nodded. "I'm getting there," I said honestly. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was the truth. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like the truth was enough.